Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please leave a like and consider subscribing. It takes a second and it helps me a lot. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Starting off, we have the case of Kenya Moch, Denver, Colorado, 2011. The night air in downtown Denver during the early spring of 2011 carried a lingering chill, the kind that settles into the pavement long after the sun has dipped behind the jagged silhouette of the Rockies. On the night of March 31st, the city was alive with the rhythmic pulse of the nightlife district, a mosaic of neon lights and muffled music spilling from open doorways. Among the crowds was 19-year-old Kenya Moch. She was a young woman known for her bright smile and a trusting nature that saw the best in everyone she met, a quality that made her beloved by her family, but one that would ultimately lead her into the path of a shadow she could not have foreseen. Kenya had spent the evening at a club called 24K, dancing and laughing with friends. However, as the night progressed, she became separated from her group. She had left her purse and her cell phone inside the club, a small oversight that would have profound consequences. Found wandering near a gas station in the early hours of April 1st, Kenya appeared disoriented. It was here, in the dim glow of the overhead fluorescent lights, that she encountered Travis Forbes. To any observer, Forbes seemed like a savior. He was a man in his mid-30s who presented himself as a good Samaritan, offering the vulnerable young woman a ride home, or at least a safe place to sober up. He spoke with a calm, reassuring tone that masked the predatory intent beneath. As the city slept, Forbes's white van moved through the quiet streets. The narrative he would later provide to the police was one of innocence. He claimed he had picked her up, encountered another man who Kenya supposedly walked off with, and that he had simply gone on his way. But the reality was far more sinister. Inside that van, the sanctuary Kenya thought she had found turned into a cage. Forbes was not a helper. He was a man who moved through life with a hidden darkness, a person who had managed to evade the consequences of his impulses until that very moment. The disappearance of Kenya Moch sent a shockwave through the Denver community. Her stepfather, Tony Lee, became a fixture on local news, his voice cracking with a mixture of desperation and ironclad resolve as he pleaded for her return. The search was exhaustive. Thousands of flyers were plastered on telephone poles and shop windows, her face looking back at passers-by with an expression of frozen youth. Investigators began to peel back the layers of that night, and their focus quickly narrowed on the man in the white van. Travis Forbes played the part of the concerned citizen for a time, even sitting for interviews with the police. But the digital and physical breadcrumbs began to tell a different story. Surveillance footage showed his van at a bakery where he worked, pulling in at odd hours. Most chillingly, the bakery's security cameras captured Forbes rolling a large cooler into the building and later cleaning the floor with bleach, a chemical scent that, in the world of forensics, often smells like guilt. Despite the mounting suspicion, there was no body, and without Kenya, the case teetered on the edge of becoming another cold mystery. The breakthrough did not come from a laboratory, but from the weight of another crime. While under surveillance for Kenya's disappearance, Forbes traveled to Fort Collins, where he committed a brutal assault on another woman. This time, the survivor was able to provide the evidence needed to lock him away. Facing the prospect of a lifetime behind bars or worse, Forbes finally struck a deal with prosecutors. He would lead them to Kenya, but only if the death penalty was taken off the table. On a quiet stretch of land near Keensburg, about 40 miles northeast of Denver, the earth finally gave up its secret. Forbes led investigators to a shallow grave in a field of tall, dry grass that hissed in the wind. There, beneath the Colorado soil, Kenya was found. She had been missing for 5 months. The Good Samaritan had strangled her in the back of his van, kept her body in a freezer at the bakery, and then discarded her like refuse in the middle of the night. The resolution of the case brought a somber peace to the Moch family, but it left the city of Denver with a permanent scar. It was a reminder that the darkness does not always hide in the alleys. Sometimes it offers you a hand and a ride home. Travis Forbes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a man finally silenced by the weight of his own cruelty. Today, the fields near Keensburg are still, the grass swaying in the same rhythmic motion as it did when Kenya was first brought there. The lights of Denver still flicker against the mountains, and the city moves on, but the story of the girl who just wanted to get home safely remains a haunting lullaby. It is a story of a family's love that refused to let a daughter be forgotten, and a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, the truth eventually finds its way to the light. The memory of Kenya Monge lives on, not as a victim of a good Samaritan, but as a young woman whose life was a bright light that a coward could never truly extinguish. Next story is the disappearance of Guma Aguiar. Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 2012. The Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Fort Lauderdale does not always roar. Sometimes it hums. On the night of June 19, 2012, the water was restless, whipped into a light chop by a passing summer squall. The city lights of the Florida coastline flickered like a distant neon galaxy, casting long, shimmering reflections across the black swells. Amidst this vastness, a 31-foot center console boat named the TT Zion cut through the waves, its engines a steady, mechanical heartbeat against the rhythm of the tide. Guma Aguiar sat at the helm, a man of immense fortune and even more immense internal storms. At 35 years old, the Brazilian-born energy tycoon had lived a life defined by a sudden, dizzying ascent. He had co-founded a firm that struck a massive natural gas field in Texas, turning a modest investment into a billion-dollar windfall. He was a philanthropist and a sports mogul, but wealth, for all its power, provides no anchor against the shifting sands of the mind. As the TT Zion moved further from the shore, the sounds of the city began to fade into the mist. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the electric charge of a receding thunderstorm. Guma had left his home in a state of visible distress, stepping onto the dock, untying the lines, and vanishing into the darkening blue of the twilight. At approximately 1:15 a.m., his vessel made its return to land, but not to its private dock. The boat drifted toward the shore near East Los Olas Boulevard, eventually running aground on the sand with the engines still running, their low vibration shaking the hull. When authorities boarded the boat, they found a scene that felt suspended in time. A cell phone and a wallet sat undisturbed on the console. The keys were in the ignition and the throttle was set to forward, yet the seat was empty. There was no blood and no signs of struggle. The sea had simply claimed its passenger, leaving behind a ghost ship ghosting through the surf. The search that followed was one of the most intensive in the history of the Florida coast. The Coast Guard deployed helicopters and cutters, scouring thousands of square miles of the Atlantic, while divers navigated the silent, sandy plains of the ocean floor. They found nothing. To understand this disappearance, one must look at the weight Guma carried in the years leading up to that night. At the time he vanished, he was embroiled in high-profile lawsuits involving his own family, battles that were not merely about money, but about legacy and identity. Those close to him noted that the pressure seemed to be fracturing his reality. He had begun to believe he was a messianic figure, seeking a spiritual peace that his fortune could not purchase. On the day he vanished, a meeting with his legal counsel had gone poorly, and the walls of his life seemed to be closing in. When he pushed off from the dock, it remained unclear if he was seeking a moment of solitude or attempting to outrun the shadows that followed him. The theories regarding his fate are as varied as the currents of the Gulf Stream. The most straightforward explanation is a tragic accident, a slip on a wet deck, or a moment of dizziness in the rough swells. In the dark, with the boat moving away on autopilot, even a strong swimmer would have had little hope. Yet, the absence of a body fueled darker speculations of a staged disappearance. In the world of high finance, people whispered that a man with his resources could have been picked up by another boat, trading his chaotic life for a silent existence elsewhere. Others wondered if he had intentionally sought out the water as a final refuge from his documented mental health struggles. Years have passed, And while a judge legally declared Guma Aguiar dead in 2015, the declaration brought little closure. The case remains a haunting portrait of the fragility of the human condition, a story of a man who had everything the world says we should want, yet found himself alone on a boat in the middle of a storm. As the sun rises over Fort Lauderdale today, the Atlantic looks the same as it did on that June morning, vast, indifferent, and beautiful. The waves continue to roll in, whispering secrets that they will never fully reveal. Somewhere beneath that shimmering surface, or perhaps in a quiet corner of a world far removed from the one he left behind, lies the truth of what happened to the man who vanished into the blue. The story remains like the boat itself, adrift, with the engines still running, but the captain nowhere to be found. The water remains calm, the stars remain distant, and the mystery of Guma Aguiar continues to drift with the tide, an unfinished melody lost to the rhythm of the waves. Next story is the Cowden family murders. Applegate, Oregon, 1974. The Copper region of southern Oregon is a place where the shadows are long and the air is heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. In the summer of 1974, the Siskiyou Mountains were a verdant sanctuary, a labyrinth of ancient firs and rushing creeks that seemed a world away from the turbulence of the decade. The Applegate River wound through the valley like a ribbon of cold silk, its constant babble providing the soundtrack for those who sought refuge in the wilderness. It was here during the Labor Day weekend that the Cowden family arrived, looking for nothing more than a few days of quiet beneath the canopy of the forest. Richard Cowden was 28, a man who worked with his hands and appreciated the rugged honesty of the outdoors. His wife, Belinda, was 22, possessing a gentle spirit that mirrored the calm of the mountains. With them were their two small children, 5-year-old David, whose energy was as boundless as the woods, and 5-month-old Melissa, who was experiencing the great outdoors for the very first time. They set up their camp at a spot known as Carberry Creek, a place where the water was clear enough to see the smooth stones on the bottom and the sunlight filtered through the branches in dusty, golden shafts. The campsite was a picture of domestic simplicity. They had their Ford truck, their camping gear, and the simple comforts of a holiday weekend. On the evening of September 1st, 1974, the family was seen at a local general store in Copper, buying milk and a few supplies. Richard was seen filling a plastic jug with water. They were smiling, unremarkable, and perfectly at peace. They drove back toward their campsite as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting the valley into a soft, purple twilight. That was the last time anyone saw the Cowden family alive. The following morning, the silence at Carberry Creek was unnatural. A friend of the family, who had planned to meet them for a day of fishing, arrived at the site and found a scene that felt like a film reel had suddenly snapped. The Cowden truck was still parked in its spot. The camp stove was set out, and a pan of cold water sat upon it. On the ground, a small plastic tub was filled with soapy water, as if someone had been interrupted in the middle of washing the breakfast dishes. On a nearby log, Richard's watch and wallet lay undisturbed. Inside the truck, Belinda's purse was still there, containing her ID and money. Even more unsettling were the items left for the children. 5-month-old Melissa's diaper bag was ready, and a carton of milk sat on the ground, curdling in the morning sun. The family's beloved dog, a small basset hound, was found cowering near the campsite, alive but visibly shaken, as if it had witnessed something the human mind was not meant to process. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no spent shell casings. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed 4 human beings, leaving their physical possessions behind as a mocking tribute to their existence. The disappearance triggered what would become the largest search and rescue operation in Oregon's history. For weeks, the quiet of the Siskiyou Mountains was shattered by the sound of low-flying helicopters and the rhythmic thud of searchers' boots. Hundreds of volunteers, state police, and even psychics descended upon the Applegate Valley. They combed the thickets of blackberry bushes, peered into the dark recesses of abandoned mines, and waded through the icy currents of the river. The deeper they went into the woods, the more the forest seemed to push back, its dense undergrowth guarding secrets that had been kept for eons. As the days turned into weeks, the hope of finding the Cowdens alive began to wither like the autumn leaves. The mystery of the empty campsite became a local legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones by those who lived in the valley. The police were baffled. How could an entire family, including a nursing infant and a young child, be removed from a campsite in broad daylight without a single witness hearing a scream or seeing a struggle? The sheer logistics of moving 4 people, 2 of whom were dead weight or required carrying, implied a level of control and terrifying efficiency. The winter of 1974 was long and harsh. The snow blanketed the Siskiyou Peaks, burying the search area in a cold, white shroud. It wasn't until the following spring, 7 months after the family vanished, that the mountain finally gave up its dead. On April 12, 1975, 2 hunters were exploring a steep, densely wooded ridge about 7 miles from the Carberry Creek campsite. As they navigated a particularly treacherous slope near a small cave, they stumbled upon a sight that ended the mystery but began a nightmare. There, hidden behind a screen of brush and stones, were the remains of Richard and David Cowden. Further inside the small, shallow cave, the bodies of Belinda and baby Melissa were discovered. The elements and the wildlife had taken their toll, but the cause of death was clear. They had been executed. Richard and David had been shot, while Belinda and the infant had suffered a more intimate, brutal end. The location of the bodies was significant. It was a place so difficult to reach that it suggested the killer was intimately familiar with the local terrain, a predator who knew the hidden folds of the mountain. The discovery shifted the investigation from a missing persons case to a hunt for a monster. Suspicion soon fell upon a local man named Dwayne Lee Little. Little was a name that carried a dark weight in the region. He had been paroled only recently after serving time for the brutal murder of a young girl years earlier. He was a man who moved through the woods like a ghost, a hunter who saw people as prey. At the time of the Cowden murders, he was known to be in the area, and his history of violence fit the profile of someone capable of such an unthinkable act. However, the physical evidence was frustratingly thin. While the circumstantial links were strong and Little's reputation was fearsome, the prosecution lacked the smoking gun needed to close the case. No weapon was ever recovered that could be definitively linked to him, and no witnesses could place him at the campsite at the exact moment of the abduction. Dwayne Lee Little would eventually return to prison for other violent crimes, including the attempted murder of another woman, but he was never officially charged with the deaths of the Cowden family. To this day, the Cowden family murders remain one of the most haunting cold cases in the Pacific Northwest. The motive remains a void. Was it a robbery gone wrong, despite the money left behind? Was it a random act of opportunistic evil? Or was it something more calculated, a predator watching from the tree line, waiting for the perfect moment when the family was most vulnerable? The campsite at Carberry Creek has long since been reclaimed by the forest. The Applegate River still flows, its waters cold and indifferent to the tragedy that occurred on its banks. If you walk through those woods today, you might feel a sudden chill that has nothing to do with the weather. You might notice the way the birds stop singing as you approach a certain ridge, or the way the shadows seem to linger just a bit longer under the fir trees. The mountains keep their secrets well, and the Cowden family remains a part of the landscape now, a somber memory etched into the very soil of the Oregon wilderness. Next story, the shark arm case. Sydney, Australia, 1935. The air in Sydney during the autumn of 1935 was thick with the scent of salt spray and coal smoke. The Great Depression had cast a long, gray shadow over the city, but at the Coogee Aquarium and swimming baths, the atmosphere was one of forced gaiety and spectacle. Families crowded around the glass tanks to witness the wonders of the deep, momentarily forgetting the hardships of the era. On April 17th, just days before the Anzac Day holiday, the star attraction was a massive, 14-foot tiger shark that had been recently captured and brought to the aquarium to draw in the crowds. The shark was a restless predator, circling its tank with a slow, rhythmic grace that fascinated and unnerved the onlookers. As the days passed, the shark's health appeared to decline. It became sluggish, its movements heavy. Then, on the afternoon of April 25th, a day meant for remembrance, the shark performed a feat that would etch itself into the annals of Australian history. In front of a crowd of horrified spectators, the creature began to thrash violently. In a sudden, visceral convulsion, it vomited up its last few meals. Amidst the expected debris of marine life, a human arm bobbed to the surface of the tank. The arm was not merely a remnant of shark attack. It was a piece of a puzzle that defied logic. It was remarkably well preserved by the salty brine of the shark's stomach. Most notably, the limb had a distinctive tattoo on the forearm. Two boxers squared off in a fighting stance. Even more chillingly, medical examiners quickly determined that the arm had not been bitten off by the shark. It had been cleanly severed from a human body with a sharp blade. The shark had simply scavenged a piece of evidence from a murder that was meant to stay hidden in the depths of the Tasman Sea. The investigation that followed moved with a frantic energy through the gritty underworld of Sydney. Fingerprints taken from the preserved hand identified the limb as belonging to James "Jim" Smith, a former boxer and small-time criminal who had vanished weeks earlier. Smith was a man who lived on the periphery of the law, a fixer, an occasional informant who moved through the smoke-filled billiard halls and dockside pubs of the city. He had last been seen playing cards at a hotel in Cronulla with a man named Patrick Brady. As the police began to pull on the threads of Jim Smith's life, a web of forgery, smuggling, and betrayal began to unravel. The story moved from the pristine waters of Coogee to the dark, cramped workshops of master boat builders and the opulent offices of businessmen with dirty secrets. At the center of this web was Reginald Holmes, a wealthy boat builder who was secretly a kingpin in a massive insurance fraud and drug-running ring. Smith had been working for Holmes, but the relationship had soured. In the world of the Sydney docks, silence was the only currency that truly mattered, and Smith had become a liability. The police theorized that Smith had been murdered in a cottage in Cronulla, his body dismembered and packed into a trunk, which was then dumped into the ocean. The tiger shark, a nomadic scavenger of the deep, had simply happened upon the remains. Patrick Brady was arrested and charged with the murder, but the prosecution's case rested heavily on the testimony of Reginald Holmes. The tension in the city reached a breaking point on the morning the inquest was set to begin. Reginald Holmes was found in his car at Dawes Point, slumped over the steering wheel with a bullet hole in his head. The star witness was dead, and with him, the hope of a straightforward conviction. Holmes had survived an earlier suicide attempt, or perhaps a botched hit, only days prior, leading a high-speed boat chase through Sydney Harbor while bleeding from a head wound. But his luck had finally run out. The legal proceedings that followed were a chaotic display of technicalities. Without a body, only a single, tattooed arm, the defense argued that there was no corpus delicti, no proof that a murder had actually occurred. They argued that a man could, theoretically, live without an arm. The jury, faced with a lack of physical evidence beyond the limb in the jar and the absence of a key witness, had no choice but to acquit Brady. The shark arm case remains one of the most bizarre and evocative mysteries in the world. It is a story born of the sea's strange ability to vomit up the truth when it is least expected. If you visit the cliffs of Coogee today, where the waves crash against the rocks with a timeless fury, it is easy to imagine the secrets that still lie beneath the surface. The aquarium is gone, and the people involved have long since faded into the fog of history, but the image of the tattooed arm remains. It is a reminder that the world is smaller than we think, and that the crimes we commit in the dark have a way of finding the light. Jim Smith's arm, with its defiant boxers forever frozen in their stance, stands as a testament to a man who lived and died in a world of shadows, only to be brought back by a predator of the deep. The case ended not with a conviction, but with a lingering silence, the kind of silence that settles over the harbor when the fog rolls in, masking the truth of what really happened on that cold, salty night in 1935. Next story, the disappearance of Jim Gray. San Francisco, California, 2007. The Farallon Islands sit 27 miles off the coast of San Francisco like jagged, prehistoric teeth rising from the cold churn of the Pacific. Known as the Islands of the Dead by early mariners, they're a place of stark, lonely beauty, shrouded in a near-perpetual mist and surrounded by waters teeming with great white sharks and treacherous currents. On the morning of January 28, 2007, the weather was uncharacteristically clear, a rare, bright window in the winter sky. Jim Gray, a 62-year-old pioneer of the computer age, looked at the horizon and saw a perfect day to sail. Jim Gray was not just any sailor. He was a titan of the digital world. A Turing Award winner and a lead researcher at Microsoft, his contributions to database technology are the silent foundations upon which the modern internet rests. He was a man of immense intellect, known for his kindness and his methodical, brilliant mind. To Jim, the sea was a place of mathematical rhythm and physical challenge. He owned a 40-foot fiberglass sloop named the Tenacious, a vessel as sturdy and well-maintained as any project he had ever overseen in a laboratory. He set out from the Gashouse Cove Marina that morning with a simple, peaceful goal: to scatter his mother's ashes near the Farallones. He called his wife, Donna, as he passed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge. The majestic orange towers were bathed in sunlight, and Jim sounded relaxed, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man in his element. He mentioned that the wind was light, and he might be out of cell range for a while as he headed further into the blue. That call, brief and mundane, was the last time anyone heard from him. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the Tenacious failed to return to its slip, the silence began to feel heavy. By the next morning, the silence had turned into an emergency. The U.S. Coast Guard launched a search that would eventually cover an area the size of Indiana. They deployed C-130 Hercules planes, helicopters, and cutters, scanning the ocean with infrared sensors and high-resolution cameras. But the Pacific is a vast, indifferent graveyard. They found no debris, no oil slick, and no sign of a 40-foot white boat. What followed was one of the most unique searches in human history. Jim's colleagues, the brightest minds in Silicon Valley, refused to let the ocean have the last word. They harnessed the very technology Jim had helped create. They redirected satellites to take high-resolution images of the search area and built a custom website where thousands of volunteers across the globe could crowdsource the search. These digital beachcombers scanned over 500,000 images, looking for a white speck that might be the Tenacious. It was a global community trying to save one of its architects using his own tools. But as the days stretched into weeks, the data remained stubbornly empty. The mystery of Jim's disappearance became a haunting paradox. How does a man so tethered to the world of information, a man whose life's work was making things searchable and findable, simply vanish without a trace? The theories that emerged were many, but none offered the comfort of a conclusion. Some speculated about a rogue wave, a wall of water that can rise without warning even on a calm day, capable of capsizing a vessel in seconds. Others wondered about a sudden structural failure or a tragic accident on board that left the boat drifting on autopilot until it eventually succumbed to the waves. There was even the faint, whisper-thin possibility of a voluntary disappearance, though those who knew Jim's devotion to his family and his work dismissed it as impossible. Perhaps the most poignant theory is the most simple. The sea is just very, very large. Even with satellites and thousands of eyes, a boat is a needle in a liquid haystack. If the Tenacious took on water and sank rapidly, it would have dropped thousands of feet to the ocean floor, resting in a darkness that no camera or satellite could ever pierce. Jim Gray was legally declared dead in 2012, but his absence is still felt in the halls of research and the quiet corners of the sailing community. He vanished at the intersection of the ancient world and the modern one, leaving behind a legacy of infinite data and a personal ending of absolute silence. If you stand on the shores of Northern California today and look out toward the Farallones, you might see the white caps of the waves and feel the spray of the Pacific. It is a beautiful, restless vista, The ocean continues its rhythmic pulse, indifferent to the brilliant minds it claims or the mysteries it guards. Jim Gray, a man who taught the world how to organize knowledge, remains the one piece of information that the world can no longer find. He is part of the deep now, a silent passenger in the vast, unsearchable blue. Next story, the disappearance of Dorothy Kilgallen. New York City, 1965. The Manhattan of the mid-1960s was a city of sharp contrasts. The flickering neon of Times Square, the velvet-lined booths of the Store Club, and the cold, gray corridors of power where secrets were traded like currency. In the center of this whirlwind was Dorothy Kilgallen. To the millions who watched her every Sunday night on the hit game show What's My Line, she was the epitome of sophisticated grace, a woman with a sharp wit and a penchant for elegant evening gowns. But to the power players of Washington and the kingpins of the underworld, she was something far more formidable. The most powerful female voice in America, a relentless investigative journalist who wasn't afraid to walk into the dark. Dorothy was a woman of relentless ambition. Long before she was a television star, she was a newsman in the old-school sense, a reporter who broke barriers and chased stories across the globe. She had covered the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II and the trial of Sam Shepard, but the story that would ultimately consume her life, and perhaps end it, began in Dallas on a bright November day in 1963. The assassination of John F. Kennedy didn't just haunt the nation, it ignited a fire in Dorothy. She was one of the few journalists with the courage and the connections to publicly challenge the Warren Commission's findings, calling the official report a farcical attempt to wrap a complex conspiracy in a simple bow. By 1965, Dorothy was deep in the labyrinth. She had used her high society connections to gain exclusive access that other reporters could only dream of. She was the only journalist to conduct a private interview with Jack Ruby, the man who silenced Lee Harvey Oswald. She never revealed what was said during those 8 minutes in a back room of the Dallas courthouse, but she told friends and family that she had discovered information that would break the case wide open. She began carrying a folder everywhere, a thick, accordion-style file filled with interview notes, transcripts, and leads that she claimed would expose the true architects of the president's death. She famously told her makeup artist, "In 5 days, I'm going to New Orleans and crack this thing." She never made it to New Orleans. On the night of November 7th, 1965, Dorothy appeared on What's My Line, as she had hundreds of times before. She was charming, professional, and seemingly in good spirits. After the show, she went to P.J. Clark's for a drink, a late-night haunt for the city's elite. What happened in the early hours of November 8th remains a tapestry of shadows. The following morning, Dorothy was found dead in her Manhattan townhouse. She was discovered in a third-floor guest bedroom, a room she almost never used, still wearing her makeup, her false eyelashes, and a floral peignoir over her evening clothes. She was propped up in bed, a book resting in her lap, but the book was upside down. The bedside lamp was still glowing, casting a pale light over a scene that felt staged, like a grim tableau from a noir film. The official cause of death was listed as an accidental overdose of alcohol and barbiturates. The city's medical examiner noted that there was enough acute ethanol and barbiturate intoxication to stop a heart. But the anomalies began to pile up faster than the morning newspapers. Dorothy was a seasoned New Yorker. She knew her limits, and those close to her insisted she wasn't the type to recklessly mix pills and liquor. Furthermore, the guest room was cold, the air conditioner humming despite the autumn chill, and her usual sleeping quarters on the floor above were undisturbed. Most chillingly, the file was gone. The accordion folder, the New Orleans notes, and the transcript of her interview with Jack Ruby had vanished from the townhouse. Her office had been rifled through. The documents that she had described as her life insurance were nowhere to be found. The investigation into her death was curiously brief. No fingerprints were taken from the upside-down book or the glass on the nightstand. The mystery man she had reportedly been seen with at a cocktail lounge earlier that night was never identified or questioned. The police department seemed eager to close the book on the What's My Line star treating the death of the world's most famous investigative reporter as a mundane tragedy of a woman who simply took too much to sleep. For decades, the story of Dorothy Kilgallen has been a whisper in the halls of conspiracy culture. Was she a victim of her own success, a woman who flew too close to the sun? Or was she silenced by the very forces she was about to expose? Those who believe the latter point to the strange deaths of other witnesses and journalists tied to the JFK case, a trail of breadcrumbs that seems to lead toward a hidden hand. Today, the townhouse on East 68th Street stands as a silent witness to a mystery that has never been solved. Dorothy Kilgallen was a woman who lived her life in the bright glare of the spotlight, but she died in a shadow so deep that not even her own brilliance could pierce it. She was a seeker of truth in an era of secrets, and in the end, she became the ultimate secret herself. As the city of New York hums with the relentless energy of a new century, the memory of Dorothy Kilgallen lingers like the scent of expensive perfume in an empty room. She remains a reminder that some stories are so dangerous that they can never be told, and that sometimes the most important news is the silence that follows the final word. Next story, The Monster of the Andes. South America, 1980. The Andes are not merely mountains. They are a world unto themselves. They form a jagged, prehistoric spine that stretches across the continent, where the air is so thin it feels like glass, and the silence is so heavy it rings in the ears. In the late 1970s, this landscape was a place of isolation and ancient rhythms. In the rural villages of Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, life followed the sun. Children played in the dusty plazas of market towns, and the arrival of a stranger was usually met with a quiet curiosity. It was into this world of high altitudes and low visibility that Pedro Lopez emerged, a man who would become a shadow across 3 nations. Lopez did not look like the monster the world would later name him. He was a wanderer, a man with a weathered face and a quiet demeanor who moved through the bustling Sunday markets with the ease of a ghost. He understood the geography of neglect. He targeted the children of the poor, the young girls who ran errands for their mothers or sold trinkets to travelers. He knew that in a world without digital footprints or centralized police databases, a child could vanish into the mist of the mountains and be forgotten by everyone except those who loved them. For years, the disappearances were treated as isolated tragedies. A girl would go to the well and not return. A sister would wander a few yards from a market stall and vanish into the crowd. The local authorities, spread thin across vast, rugged territories, often lacked the resources to connect the dots. They didn't see the pattern because the pattern was being woven across thousands of miles of mountain passes and international borders. Lopez was a nomad of death, moving from the emerald valleys of Colombia to the coastal plains of Peru, and finally into the volcanic heart of Ecuador. The scale of his crimes is something the human mind struggles to hold. When he was finally apprehended in 1980, it wasn't through a brilliant stroke of detective work, but through the raw, desperate justice of a marketplace. In Ambato, Ecuador, he attempted to lure a young girl away, but he was spotted by a group of market women who sensed the darkness beneath his calm exterior. They cornered him, and he was nearly lynched before the police intervened. In the cold, sterile confines of an interrogation room, the facade finally cracked, not with a whimper of guilt, but with a roar of pride. Lopez began to speak, and as he did, the world turned cold. He didn't just confess to murders, he narrated them. He spoke of the Sacred Valley, near Ambato, a place where the earth held secrets that only he knew. He led investigators into the high country, where the wind whistles through the dry grass and the clouds sit low on the ridges. He pointed to patches of earth that looked no different from the rest of the landscape. But as the police began to dig, the reality of his words took form. They found the remains of dozens of children, then hundreds. The tally eventually climbed toward a number that felt impossible, over 300 victims. The story of Pedro Lopez, however, does not end with a life sentence or a final reckoning. It ends with a bureaucratic silence, that is perhaps more terrifying than the crimes themselves. Due to the laws in Ecuador at the time, the maximum sentence was only 16 years. Lopez played the part of the reformed man, a model prisoner who claimed to have found God. In 1998, he was released on bail for good behavior and deported to Colombia. He stepped out of the prison gates and into the morning light of a continent he had spent decades terrorizing. For a brief moment, he was seen in a psychiatric hospital in Bogota, but then he simply walked out the door. The man who had claimed the lives of hundreds of innocent souls vanished into the very mist he had used to hide his crimes. There was no final trial, no execution, no closure. Today, the Andes remain as they have always been, indifferent, majestic, and silent. The wind still carries the scent of wood smoke and cold stone through the mountain passes. The markets are still loud with the sounds of trade and laughter. But for those who know the history of the 1980s, the silence of the peaks feels a bit more hollow. Somewhere in the vastness of South America, or perhaps in the quiet corner of a forgotten village, the monster of the Andes may still be breathing. He is a living ghost, a reminder that the world is large enough for even the most horrific truths to be lost in the shadows of the mountains. Next story, the disappearance of Ben McDaniel. Ponce de Leon, Florida, 2010. If you drive into the deep, humid heart of the Florida Panhandle, past the Pine Barrens and the old tobacco barns, you will find Vortex Spring. To the casual visitor, it is a paradise, a 200-foot wide basin of water, so clear it looks like liquid sapphire. The water stays a constant 68 degrees year-round, rising from an underground aquifer with a force that creates a gentle, rhythmic boil on the surface. But for a specific breed of adventurer, the beauty of the surface is just a veil. Beneath the sun-drenched pool lies a gate to a world of absolute darkness. Ben McDaniel was a man who felt the pull of that darkness. At 30 years old, Ben was a handsome, athletic man who had reached a crossroads in his life. After his business in Tennessee struggled and a personal relationship ended, he sought the solace of the water. He was a technical diver, someone who didn't just want to see fish, but wanted to explore the skeletal architecture of the earth. He became a fixture at Vortex Spring in the summer of 2010, spending his days diving deeper and deeper into the cave system that branched off from the main basin. The cave at Vortex Spring is a labyrinth of limestone and silt. It begins with a cavern, a wide-mouthed chamber where the light from the surface still reaches in pale, flickering beams. But beyond the cavern lies the cave, a restricted area blocked by a heavy steel gate. To go past that gate, a diver needs a specific certification and a key. Ben, however, didn't have the certification, and he didn't have a key. He had been seen by locals using a piece of wire or a shuck to bypass the lock, driven by an obsessive need to see what lay in the unexplored silt-outs and tight squeezes of the far reaches. On the evening of August 18, 2010, the sun was setting, casting long, orange shadows across the spring. Two employees of the dive shop watched as Ben geared up. He was carrying extra tanks of compressed air, a sign that he planned to be down for a long time. They saw him submerge, the bubbles from his regulator breaking the surface in a steady, silver rhythm. They watched his dive lights descend until they were just two glowing embers in the blue deep, and then they watched him bypass the gate. That was the last time Ben McDaniel was seen by a living soul. When his truck remained in the parking lot 2 days later, the alarm was raised. What followed was a recovery mission that pushed the limits of human endurance. The best cave divers in the world, men who specialize in navigating tunnels so tight they have to remove their tanks to squeeze through, descended into the spring. They expected to find Ben's body near the entrance or perhaps caught in a ceiling trap. But the cave was empty. They pushed further than Ben should have been able to go. They explored the unmappable sections, areas where the silt is so fine that a single kick of a fin can turn the water into a blinding whiteout of mud. They used sonar, underwater cameras, and even cadaver dogs on the surface. They found 2 of Ben's tanks near the gate, but they found no trace of Ben. No mask, no fins, no weight belt. In a cave system with only one way in and one way out, A grown man had simply ceased to exist. The mystery of Ben McDaniel divided the diving community and his own family. One theory is the impossible squeeze. Some believe Ben, in a moment of panic or misplaced confidence, pushed himself into a crevice so narrow and so deep that his body became a permanent part of the limestone, hidden in a chamber that no other diver has yet discovered. The weight of the water and the shifting silt would have buried him in a tomb of his own making. But there's another theory, one that whispers of a more calculated exit. Ben's life on the surface was in turmoil. Could he have used the cave as a stage for his own disappearance? Some speculate he could have exited the water at night, unnoticed, and walked away into the woods to start a new life, leaving his truck and his past behind in the blue depths. Yet, those who knew him best say he would never have left his family with such a haunting void. Today, Vortex Spring remains a popular destination. On hot summer days, children splash in the basin, unaware that just 100 feet below their feet, a gate stands in the darkness. The mystery of Ben McDaniel is a silent passenger in those waters. It is a story of a man who went looking for peace in the deep and found a silence that the world has never been able to break. The spring continues to boil, the water continues to flow, and the cave keeps its secret, wrapped in a darkness that no light has ever been able to fully pierce. Next story, the murder of Gurley Chu Hassenkoff. Albuquerque, New Mexico, 1999. In the high, dry desert of Albuquerque, the horizon is a jagged line where the Sandia Mountains meet a sky that seems too vast for human concerns. In late 1999, this landscape became the backdrop for a story so bizarre it felt less like a police report and more like a fever dream of science fiction and ancient paranoia. At the heart of it was Gurley Chu, a 36-year-old woman from Malaysia who had moved to America with dreams of a stable, happy life. She was a bank teller known for her quiet diligence and a gentle spirit, but the man she married, Diazian Hassenkoff, was a creature of a different sort. Diazian was a man who lived in the cracks between reality and delusion. He claimed to be a world-renowned geneticist, a doctor who had found a secret to eternal life, and a man with deep connections to the hidden corridors of the federal government. He told people he was thousands of years old, an extraterrestrial soul inhabiting a human body, and that he was involved in a cosmic war between shadow civilizations. To the unsuspecting, his charisma was a trap. To those who looked closer, he was a sociopathic con artist who used the language of science to mask a profound and violent narcissism. By September 1999, Gurley Chu had seen behind the curtain. She had filed for divorce and was living in a state of constant, quiet terror. She told her coworkers and her lawyer that if she ever went missing, they shouldn't look for an accident. They should look for Diazian. She knew that her husband's scientific experiments and his strange, late-night meetings were the manifestations of a man who viewed other people as biological specimens rather than human beings. On the evening of September 9th, Gurley disappeared. She didn't show up for her shift at the bank, an absence that immediately sent a ripple of alarm through those who knew her. When police entered her apartment, they were met with a sterile, unsettling scene. The air smelled of bleach. The carpets had been scrubbed so thoroughly they were still damp. But in the fibers, forensic investigators found something the cleaner couldn't erase: tiny, microscopic droplets of blood. The investigation soon spiraled into a realm of the surreal. Evidence led the police to a woman named Linda Henning, a local boutique owner who had become one of Diazian's most devoted disciples. Linda believed in his stories of alien life and genetic perfection. She viewed Diazian as a messianic figure and Gurley as an obstacle to a grand, cosmic design. When investigators searched Linda's home, they found a collection of items that defied explanation. Ninja-style throwing stars, strange chemical compounds, and, most crucially, a piece of clothing stained with Gurley Chu's DNA. But the most haunting piece of evidence was found miles away, in the desolate scrubland of the New Mexico desert. Near a lonely stretch of highway, a road worker discovered a tarp and a set of blood-stained clothes. Mixed in with the biological evidence was something that felt like a signature of the killer's madness: several strands of cat hair. Not just any cat hair, but hair that matched the pets in Linda Henning's home. As the trial unfolded, the public was treated to a spectacle of the macabre. Diazian Hasenkopf, even when faced with life in prison, refused to drop his persona. He spoke of government conspiracies and advanced technologies, attempting to turn the courtroom into a stage for his delusions. Linda Henning, too, seemed caught in his gravity, her defense a tangled web of recovered memories and claims of being framed by shadowy entities. The most chilling aspect of the case, however, remains the silence of the desert. Despite the convictions of both Diazian and Linda, Girly Chew's body was never found. Diazian once boasted that he had used his scientific knowledge to ensure she would never be discovered, hinting at chemical dissolution or a burial in a place so remote it existed off the map. He treated the location of her remains as his final piece of leverage, a secret he would carry into the dark of his prison cell. The story of Girly Chew Hasenkopf is a tragedy of a woman who was caught in a storm of human ego and cosmic delusion. It is a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who dress their madness in the clothing of authority and the language of the future. If you stand on the outskirts of Albuquerque today and watch the sun set over the desert, the colors turn from gold to a deep, bruised purple. The wind moves through the sagebrush with a low, whistling sound, carrying the dust of the old world over the secrets of the new. Somewhere in that vast, echoing space, Girly Chew remains a part of the landscape, a quiet soul lost to a man who thought he was a god, but who was ultimately just a coward hiding in the dark. Next story, the disappearance of Stephen Kabatsky. Lake Michigan, 1978. In the dead of winter, Lake Michigan is not a body of water so much as it is a shifting, frozen desert. The wind howls across the ice floes, carving ridges into the snow and creating a landscape that is both beautiful and lethally indifferent. In February of 1978, the dunes of Saugatuck, Michigan, were buried under a thick, white mantle. Stephen Kabatsky, a 23-year-old student at Hope College, was a man who felt a deep pull toward this frozen wilderness. He was an experienced outdoorsman, a thinker, and a solo traveler who often sought the quiet clarity of the winter woods. On a bright, biting afternoon, he strapped on his cross-country skis and set out toward the shoreline, looking for a day of solitude. He never returned to his car. When Stephen failed to appear for his classes, a search party was organized. They followed his tracks into the dunes, tracing the thin, parallel lines of his skis as they wound through the beach grass and over the hummocks of snow. The trail led directly toward the edge of the lake, where the land meets the massive, unstable shelves of ice that jut out into the water. There, the tracks simply stopped. The scene the searchers found was eerie in its stillness. They discovered Stephen's skis and his backpack sitting on the ice, neatly placed as if he had just stepped away for a moment to admire the view. His footprints led a short distance further toward the open water, but there were no return prints. There were no signs of struggle, no broken ice indicating a fall, and no blood. It was as if Stephen Kabatsky had reached the edge of the world and decided to step off. The authorities searched for days, flying over the white expanse and drilling into the ice, but the Great Lakes are vast, and the winter current is a powerful thief. Eventually, they presumed him dead, another victim of the lake's seasonal cruelty. Then, 15 months later, the impossible happened. On May 5th, 1979, a man woke up in a grassy field in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, 700 miles away from the frozen shores of Lake Michigan. He was wearing clothes he didn't recognize, and he felt a strange, heavy fog lifting from his mind. He walked to a nearby farmhouse and asked where he was. When he was told he was in New England, he was gripped by a profound sense of disorientation. The man was Stephen Kabatsky. To Stephen, no time had passed at all. He remembered the cold wind on his face in Michigan. He remembered the feeling of the sun on the snow. And then, he remembered nothing. Between the moment he stood on the ice in February 1978 and the moment he woke up in May 1979, there was a void, a 15-month gap in his consciousness that he could not account for. He discovered he was carrying a backpack filled with maps from regions he had never visited and wearing shoes that were worn down from hundreds of miles of walking. He had been living a life, moving through the world, eating, sleeping, and traveling, yet his self had been entirely absent. The story of Stephen Kabatsky became a focal point for those interested in the fringes of the human experience. Some spoke of fugue states, a rare psychological phenomenon where a person suffers a total loss of identity and wanders away to start a new life, only to wake up months or years later. Others, intrigued by the location of his disappearance, an area some call the Lake Michigan Triangle, whispered of more esoteric explanations: time slips, dimensional rifts, or even extraterrestrial intervention. They pointed to the neat placement of his gear as evidence of a departure that wasn't planned by the man himself. Stephen, however, chose not to dwell in the mystery. He returned to his life, finished his education, and eventually became a psychologist, perhaps seeking to understand the very mind that had once abandoned him. He rarely spoke of the gap in his life, treating the 15 months of lost time as a closed room he had no key to enter. Today, the dunes of Saugatuck still shift with the wind, and Lake Michigan still freezes into a jagged, white plains each winter. The spot where his skis were found is once again covered in snow, silent and unchanging. The mystery of Stephen Kabatsky remains one of the most compelling glitches in the fabric of ordinary life. It is a story that suggests the mind is a far more mysterious territory than any forest or frozen lake, and that sometimes the greatest journey we take is the one we can never remember. Next story: the murder of Helen Jewett. New York City, 1836. The geographical atmosphere of New York City in 1836 was one of explosive, chaotic growth, defined by the rapid expansion of commerce and the dramatic social divide between the wealthy elite and the burgeoning underworld. The specific locus of the crime was 41 Thomas Street in Lower Manhattan, a location in the notorious geographical area known as the Five Points and the surrounding districts. This area was a volatile mix of legitimate businesses, taverns, and high-end brothels. The air was dense, smoky from coal fires, and carried the specific, strong odor of unmanaged sewage and the heavy perfumes of the surrounding pleasure houses. The streets were dark at night, lit only by gas lamps and the faint, yellow glow spilling from the windows, creating an atmosphere of secrecy and shadow, a perfect geography for hidden vice. The central figure was Helen Jewett, 23, a highly sought-after, sophisticated sex worker who worked at Rosina Townsend's luxurious brothel on Thomas Street. Jewett was known for her literacy, intelligence, and expensive taste, distinguishing her from the common prostitutes of the time. The crime occurred in the early hours of Sunday, April 10, 1836. Jewett's room on the third floor of the brothel became the contained, tragic geographical stage of the murder. The sequence of the crime, according to witnesses, began with the arrival of a wealthy, regular client, Richard P. Robinson, a 19-year-old law clerk from a prominent and geographically distant Maine family. Robinson, who used a distinctive, dark cloak to conceal his identity, entered the brothel and went directly to Jewett's room. The murder was one of extreme violence. Jewett was struck on the head with an axe or hatchet, causing her death. The murderer then wrapped a string around her neck and set her bed on fire, likely intending to use the resulting chaos and geographical displacement of the fire to destroy the evidence and conceal his escape. The atmosphere of the brothel was ruptured by the fire. The other occupants quickly discovered the small, contained blaze in Jewett's room. They extinguished the fire and, in the process, discovered Jewett's body on the bed, burned, beaten, and partially stripped. The investigation was immediate, driven by the sensational nature of the crime and the victim's notoriety. Rosina Townsend, the madam, immediately implicated Richard Robinson, identifying him as the man who had been in Jewett's room. Robinson was quickly arrested at the geographical remove of his boarding house, miles uptown. The geographical evidence found at the crime scene and traced back to Robinson was compelling. The cloak, The victim's neighbors and the brothel staff consistently described the murderer's distinctive dark cloak, which Robinson was known to wear. The weapon. The hatchet/axe used in the murder was never found, a major forensic constraint. The alibi. Robinson initially claimed an ironclad alibi, asserting he was at his boarding house all night. The trial of Richard Robinson became a massive geographical and cultural spectacle, widely covered by the sensationalist New York press, which was just beginning to emerge as a powerful force. The trial was defined by the deep social conflict of the time. The city's elite attempting to protect one of their own, and the working-class community demanding justice for a woman from the lower social strata. The defense, led by a formidable legal team, meticulously attacked the geographical reliability of the witnesses and the moral character of the brothel's inhabitants. They argued that the witnesses, being prostitutes and criminals, were unreliable and that Townsend's identification of Robinson was motivated by revenge or a desire for notoriety. The geographical origin of the evidence, a brothel, was used to discredit all testimony. The most crucial geographical flaw in the prosecution's case was the lack of definitive, non-circumstantial physical evidence linking Robinson to the murder weapon or to the crime scene that transcended the testimony of the brothel's occupants. The trial concluded with a verdict of not guilty after the jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes. The atmosphere of the city's elite had effectively overridden the facts of the case. Robinson's wealth, social standing, and powerful legal representation allowed him to walk free. Richard Robinson, though acquitted, was socially ruined. He quickly left the geographical area of New York and changed his name, spending the rest of his life in obscurity. The murder of Helen Jewett is a seminal case in American criminal history. It remains officially unsolved, though the circumstantial evidence against Robinson was overwhelming. The case is a grim study in the power of geographical and social disparity, how the victim's place in the city's social geography, a brothel in a slum, allowed the perpetrator, protected by his place in the city's elite geography, a wealthy family and a high-status profession, to quite literally get away with murder. The crime's permanent legacy is the fact that a rich man's life was deemed more valuable than the truth about the murder of a poor, working woman. Next story, the murder of Helen Jewett. New York City, 1836. The geographical atmosphere of New York City in 1836 was one of explosive, chaotic growth, defined by the rapid expansion of commerce and the dramatic social divide between the wealthy elite and the burgeoning underworld. The specific locus of the crime was 41 Thomas Street in Lower Manhattan, a location in the notorious geographical area known as the Five Points and the surrounding districts. This area was a volatile mix of legitimate businesses, taverns, and high-end brothels. The air was dense, smoky from coal fires, and carried the specific, strong odor of unmanaged sewage and the heavy perfumes of the surrounding pleasure houses. The streets were dark at night, lit only by gas lamps and the faint, yellow glow spilling from the windows, creating an atmosphere of secrecy and shadow, a perfect geography for hidden vice. The central figure was Helen Jewett, 23, a highly sought-after, sophisticated sex worker who worked at Rosina Townsend's luxurious brothel on Thomas Street. Jewett was known for her literacy, intelligence, and expensive taste, distinguishing her from the common prostitutes of the time. The crime occurred in the early hours of Sunday, April 10, 1836. Jewett's room on the third floor of the brothel became the contained, tragic geographical stage of the murder. The sequence of the crime, according to witnesses, began with the arrival of a wealthy, regular client, Richard P. Robinson, a 19-year-old law clerk from a prominent and geographically distant Maine family. Robinson, who used a distinctive, dark cloak to conceal his identity, entered the brothel and went directly to Jewett's room. The murder was one of extreme violence. Jewett was struck on the head with an axe or hatchet, causing her death. The murderer then wrapped a string around her neck and set her bed on fire, likely intending to use the resulting chaos and geographical displacement of the fire to destroy the evidence and conceal his escape. The atmosphere of the brothel was ruptured by the fire. The other occupants quickly discovered the small, contained blaze in Jewett's room. They extinguished the fire and, in the process, discovered Jewett's body on the bed, burned, beaten, and partially stripped. The investigation was immediate, driven by the sensational nature of the crime and the victim's notoriety. Rosina Townsend, the madam, immediately implicated Richard Robinson, identifying him as the man who had been in Jewett's room. Robinson was quickly arrested at the geographical remove of his boarding house, miles uptown. The geographical evidence found at the crime scene and traced back to Robinson was compelling. The cloak. The victim's neighbors and the brothel staff consistently described the murderer's distinctive dark cloak, which Robinson was known to wear. The weapon. The hatchet/axe used in the murder was never found, a major forensic constraint. The alibi. Robinson initially claimed an ironclad alibi, asserting he was at his boarding house all night. The trial of Richard Robinson became a massive geographical and cultural spectacle, widely covered by the sensationalist New York press, which was just beginning to emerge as a powerful force. The trial was defined by the deep social conflict of the time, the city's elite attempting to protect one of their own, and the working-class community demanding justice for a woman from the lower social strata. The defense, led by a formidable legal team, meticulously attacked the geographical reliability of the witnesses and the moral character of the brothel's inhabitants. They argued that the witnesses, being prostitutes and criminals, were unreliable and that Townsend's identification of Robinson was motivated by revenge or a desire for notoriety. The geographical origin of the evidence, a brothel, was used to discredit all testimony. The most crucial geographical flaw in the prosecution's case was the lack of definitive, non-circumstantial physical evidence linking Robinson to the murder weapon or to the crime scene that transcended the testimony of the brothel's occupants. The trial concluded with a verdict of not guilty after the jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes. The atmosphere of the city's elite had effectively overridden the facts of the case. Robinson's wealth, social standing, and powerful legal representation allowed him to walk free. Richard Robinson, though acquitted, was socially ruined. He quickly left the geographical area of New York and changed his name, spending the rest of his life in obscurity. The murder of Helen Jewett is a seminal case in American criminal history. It remains officially unsolved, though the circumstantial evidence against Robinson was overwhelming. The case is a grim study in the power of geographical and social disparity, how the victim's place in the city's social geography, a brothel in a slum, allowed the perpetrator, protected by his place in the city's elite geography, a wealthy family and a high-status profession, to quite literally get away with murder. The crime's permanent legacy is the fact that a rich man's life was deemed more valuable than the truth about the murder of a poor, working woman. Next story, the disappearance of Zeb Quinn. Asheville, North Carolina, 2000. The turn of the millennium in Asheville was a time of transition, where the crisp mountain air of the Blue Ridge began to mingle with the neon hum of a growing city. On the evening of January 2nd, 2000, 18-year-old Zeb Quinn was finishing his shift at the local Walmart. Zeb was a young man described by his friends as dependable, perhaps even a bit shy, with a shock of dark hair and an easygoing nature. He had plans that night, simple suburban plans. He was going to look at a new car with his friend, Robert Jason Owens. The two met in the bright, fluorescent-lit parking lot of the store around 9 p.m., two silhouettes against the cold North Carolina night, and began a journey that would end in one of the most surreal mysteries in American history. As they drove in separate cars toward their destination, Zeb reportedly received a page on his beeper, a relic of that era's communication. According to Owens, Zeb became visibly frantic after seeing the number. He pulled his car over, used a payphone, and returned to Owens in a state of high agitation. He claimed he had to cancel their plans and sped off, clipping Owens' truck in his haste. That was the last time Zeb Quinn was seen alive. But in the days that followed, the mystery didn't just deepen. It became bizarre, shifting from a missing persons case into a series of haunting, disjointed clues that felt like scenes from a David Lynch film. 2 days after he vanished, a woman in a blonde wig called the Walmart where Zeb worked, pretending to be him and claiming he was sick and wouldn't be coming in. The voice was clearly not Zeb's, and the call was traced back to a local Volvo plant, where Robert Jason Owens worked. Then, 2 weeks later, Zeb's car, a light blue Mazda Protege, was discovered abandoned in the parking lot of a barbecue restaurant. It sat beneath the dim yellow glow of the streetlights, a silent vessel for a terrifying message. Drawn onto the rear window in pink lipstick was a large, mocking pair of lips. Inside the car, investigators found a live black Labrador puppy. It was shivering, huddled in the floorboard amidst several empty drink bottles and a hotel key that led nowhere. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, and no Zeb. The puppy was a ghost of a clue, a living thing left behind by someone who wanted to inject a sense of the absurd into a tragedy. The lipstick, the wig, the dog. It felt like a performance, a deliberate attempt to distract and confuse the authorities. For 15 years, the case of Zeb Quinn hung over Asheville like the morning fog in the hollows. Robert Jason Owens remained the primary person of interest, but without a body or a confession, the trail remained cold. The mystery of the lipstick car became a local legend, a story told in hushed tones about the boy who vanished into the dark and left a puppy in his place. It wasn't until 2015 that the silence was finally broken, but the resolution came through a different horror entirely. Owens was arrested for the unrelated, gruesome murders of a local food stylist and her husband. As the investigation into that tragedy unfolded, the earth at Owens's property began to yield secrets it had held since the winter of 2000. In 2017, authorities officially charged Owens with the murder of Zeb Quinn, alleging that the young man had been killed and his remains destroyed shortly after that night at the Walmart. While the specific details of Zeb's final moments remain largely locked within Owens's mind, the conviction brought a cold, somber closure to a family that had waited half a lifetime for an answer. Today, the parking lot where Zeb was last seen is much the same, filled with the mundane bustle of shoppers and the hum of traffic. The Blue Ridge Mountains still watch over the city, ancient and silent. The story of Zeb Quinn remains a reminder of the thin line between the everyday and the unthinkable. It is a story that began with a simple plan and ended with a series of strange, colorful masks. A puppy, a pair of painted lips, and a blonde wig, all designed to hide the predatory darkness of a man who moved among them. The fog eventually lifted, revealing the truth, but the image of that blue car in the night remains a haunting icon of a life interrupted by a senseless, surreal evil. Next story, the Clutter family murders. Holcomb, Kansas, 1959. Located in the vast, flat plains of western Kansas, this was a geography defined by immense, uninterrupted horizons and the annual cycle of wheat and sorghum farming. The air was dry, cold, and carried the specific, clean scent of harvested fields and dust. The social atmosphere was one of absolute, unquestioned trust. People rarely locked their doors. The central figures were the Clutter family. Herbert Clutter, a prosperous, respected farmer, his wife, Bonnie, and their two youngest children, Nancy, 16, and Kenyon, 15. The locus of the crime was their two-story white farmhouse, a large, well-kept structure situated in an isolated, rural geographical pocket several miles from the small town of Holcomb. The house was a symbol of the family's success and the security of the American heartland. The perpetrators were Richard Dick Hickok, 28, and Perry Smith, 31, two recently paroled ex-convicts who had met in the geographical confinement of the Kansas State Penitentiary. They were drawn to the Clutter farm by a false rumor from a former cellmate that Herbert Clutter kept a large safe containing thousands of dollars in cash hidden in his house. The crime was meticulously planned based on this geographical deception. The crime began in the late hours of Saturday, November 14, 1959. Hickok and Smith drove across the isolated, flat geography of western Kansas and entered the Clutter farmhouse through an unlocked side door. The atmosphere inside the house was one of deep, unsuspecting sleep. The four family members were quickly awakened, tied up, and moved to different geographical areas of the house. The entire house became the stage for a night of terror. defined by the killer's desperate, increasingly frantic search for the non-existent safe. The ultimate tragedy unfolded after the killers realized there was no safe and no large sum of cash. The geographical layout of the final murder locations showed a brutal progression. Kenyon and Herbert Clutter were tied up and moved to the basement, a dark, cold, subterranean geography. They were each killed by a single shotgun blast to the head. Nancy Clutter was moved to her bedroom on the second floor, the highest geographical point of the house, where she was shot in the head. Bonnie Clutter was moved to a separate, smaller room on the second floor, where she was also shot. The method was ruthless. The victims were placed on a mattress or cushion and killed at close range with a 12-gauge shotgun, using ammunition that was designed to leave massive, internal damage, minimizing the noise that might carry through the isolated geography. The only items the killers took were approximately $40 in cash, a portable radio, and a pair of binoculars, a haul that was tragically disproportionate to the brutality of the act. The bodies were discovered the following morning, Sunday, November 15th, by Nancy Clutter's friends who arrived for a planned outing. The geographical scene, the quiet, isolated farmhouse, was instantly transformed into a symbol of horrifying, incomprehensible violence. The investigation was led by KBI agent Alvin Dewey. The primary problem was the lack of motive, no significant theft, and a lack of witnesses in the sparsely populated rural geography. The only clue at the scene was a bloody footprint left on the basement floor. The geographical break came nearly 6 weeks later, when an informant, a former cellmate of Hickok and Smith named Floyd Wells, contacted the authorities. Wells, who had worked as a farmhand for Clutter, had shared the initial rumor of the safe with Hickok in prison. He directed investigators to the two ex-convicts, who were traveling across the geographically immense American Southwest. The authorities began a methodical, nationwide chase. Hickok and Smith, unaware they were suspects, were drifting across the vast, anonymous geographical space of the country, committing small thefts and passing bad checks. The trail led from Kansas to Oklahoma, through Texas, and eventually to Miami, Florida. The geographical containment of the fugitives finally occurred in Las Vegas, Nevada, where the two men were apprehended on December 30th, 1959, based on a tip from a highway patrolman. During their separate interrogations, the geographical truth of the crime was revealed. Perry Smith confessed, providing precise, agonizing details of the night, including the motive. The rage and frustration that built when they discovered the geographical deception, that the safe and the money did not exist. Smith specifically admitted to cutting Herbert Clutter's throat before shooting him. The initial, faint footprint found in the Clutter basement was matched to Smith's distinctive boots. The trial was held in the small, emotionally charged geographical center of Garden City, Kansas. Both men were convicted and sentenced to death. They spent 5 years appealing their sentence, confined to the prison geography of death row, before they were executed by hanging in 1965. The Clutter family murders were chronicled by Truman Capote in his groundbreaking nonfiction novel, In Cold Blood. Capote's work meticulously detailed the geographical contrast between the vast, open, trusting landscape of Holcomb and the dark, contained violence committed in the isolated farmhouse. Today, the Clutter farmhouse remains a private residence. The atmosphere of trust and openness in Holcomb was permanently destroyed. The case is an indelible historical lesson on how the isolation and perceived safety of a remote geographical area can attract the very evil it seeks to exclude, making the contained, domestic space a highly vulnerable target for outside violence. Next story, the Cranston kidnapping. Cranston, Rhode Island, 1953. Situated immediately southwest of Providence, Cranston was a dense, middle-class city where neighbors were close and social life was defined by routine. The air was cool and often damp, carrying the faint, familiar scent of the nearby Narragansett Bay. This was a place where a child's disappearance was immediately and profoundly disruptive to the entire social and geographical fabric of the community. The central figures were 8-year-old Alan Coons and his parents, who lived in a typical Cranston neighborhood. The crime began on the morning of Wednesday, December 16, 1953. Allen had left his home and was walking the short, familiar route to his elementary school. The geographical setting of the abduction was the street itself, a familiar suburban locale. A man driving a dark sedan pulled over and lured Allen into the car. The geographical isolation that often characterizes kidnappings was absent. This was an audacious crime committed in broad daylight within the visible geography of a residential street. The immediate crisis was compounded by the fact that the Coons family was not wealthy. The kidnapping was an act of personal desperation, not high-stakes professional crime. The perpetrator, a 28-year-old former construction worker and part-time chauffeur named Walter J.S. Pliam, was motivated by a mixture of financial ruin and a warped desire to regain his estranged wife's attention by using the child as a bargaining chip. Pliam drove Allen Coons across the geographically confined state of Rhode Island, eventually bringing him to a small, isolated cabin he had rented in the remote, sparsely populated area of West Greenwich. This location, deep in the state's rural interior, provided the geographical containment Pliam needed to hold the child and execute his ransom demand. The cabin was primitive and far from any neighbors, ensuring the silence of the kidnapping. The atmosphere in Cranston was immediate panic. The police mobilized an immense search, focusing on the suburban geography and the surrounding highways. The search was conducted with the urgency that defined the post-Lindbergh era, where child abduction was the most feared of crimes. The ransom communication was poorly handled by the perpetrator, betraying the amateur nature of the crime. Pliam sent several rambling, confused notes to the Coons family, demanding money, but failing to establish a clear, reliable method for payment. The police, using phone taps and surveillance, attempted to trace the geographical origin of the calls and notes. The crucial turning point came quickly, a matter of just 48 hours. Pliam, in an act of desperation or fear, decided to release the boy. He drove Allen from the remote, wooded isolation of West Greenwich back into the familiar, populated geographical area of Cranston. Pliam released the boy just a few blocks from the Coons' home, near a well-traveled street corner, telling him to walk the rest of the way. Allen Coons, uninjured but understandably shaken, was found walking alone by a passing motorist, who quickly brought him home. The atmosphere of panic in Cranston was instantly replaced by an enormous wave of relief. The release of the boy gave the police a wealth of crucial geographical and descriptive information. Allen Coons, an intelligent child, provided a detailed description of the perpetrator and the interior of the car. Most critically, he accurately described the geography of the cabin and the remote, rural area where he was held, including the presence of a unique, multicolored rope in the cabin. This geographical description, combined with information from local residents in West Greenwich who recalled seeing a dark sedan frequenting the area, allowed the police to pinpoint the specific, isolated cabin. The police rapidly located and secured the cabin. Inside, the forensic evidence confirmed the boy's story, the multicolored rope and other personal items belonging to Pliam. The search quickly led investigators back to Pliam's known geographical ties in the area. Walter Pliam was arrested soon after. He immediately confessed to the crime, detailing his pathetic financial motives and his plan to use the boy to win back his wife. His conviction was swift and definitive, based on the physical evidence found in the confined, isolated cabin and the overwhelming testimony of the boy. Pliam was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The Cranston kidnapping, unlike many sensational cases, was solved rapidly, largely due to the incompetence of the perpetrator and the specific, traceable geographical information provided by the young victim. The case became a national headline, not for its brutality, but for the profound relief of the child's safe return. Today, Cranston is a dense, well-established suburb, and the street where Allen Coons was abducted is indistinguishable from thousands of others. The remote cabin in West Greenwich is gone, absorbed by the state's natural geography. The case stands as a testament to the power of a victim's memory to defeat geographical isolation and how quickly an entire community can be mobilized and paralyzed by the fear of a crime that violates the perceived security of the most ordinary, contains spaces of suburban life. Next story, the murder of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Sing Sing Prison, New York, 1953. The Rosenberg case was not defined by a single crime scene, but by the overwhelming, pervasive anxiety of the Cold War and the ideological confrontation between two global superpowers. The setting was the entire geographical span of the United States, viewed through the lens of heightened security, espionage, and political paranoia. The air, particularly in the urban centers of the East Coast, was charged with the tension of potential nuclear conflict. The specific locus of the final act was Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, a massive, imposing institution situated on the banks of the Hudson River. The prison itself was a contained, isolated geography of finality. The light filtering into the death house was dim and institutional, and the soundscape was one of deep, chilling silence, broken only by the routine sounds of the prison and the distant rush of the river. The central figures were Julius Rosenberg, 35, and Ethel Rosenberg, 37, a working-class couple and committed members of the Communist Party. Julius was an engineer who worked for the U.S. Army Signal Corps in New Jersey. Ethel was a former union organizer. The crime was not one of violence, but of geographical and technological betrayal, conspiracy to commit espionage. The period was 1944 to 1945, at the height of the development of the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project, in the geographically disparate secret sites across the country. Julius Rosenberg, motivated by ideological commitment to the Soviet Union, was accused of operating as the primary recruiter and coordinator of a spy ring that funneled classified military and industrial information to the Soviets. The geographical nodes of his network included David Greenglass, Ethel's brother, an army machinist who worked at the secret Los Alamos, New Mexico, laboratory, the most geographically sensitive site of the Manhattan Project. Greenglass was the key source, providing diagrams and technical information on the atomic bomb, which he delivered across the country. Harry Gold, a courier who traveled geographically vast distances, primarily delivering the information from Greenglass in New Mexico to the Soviet handlers in New York City. The geographical nature of the conspiracy was one of information transmission across vast American distances, from the remote desert labs to the urban drop zones of New York. The information was used by the Soviet Union to successfully test their own atomic bomb in 1949, years earlier than expected, fundamentally shifting the global geographical balance of power. The investigation that led to the Rosenbergs began in 1950, when the British intelligence services, collaborating with American authorities, traced the espionage back to a German physicist, Klaus Fuchs, who had worked on the Manhattan Project. Fuchs led investigators to Harry Gold, who in turn implicated David Greenglass, and Greenglass ultimately implicated his sister, Ethel, and her husband, Julius. The trial of the Rosenbergs, held in New York in 1951, became a global geographical flashpoint, representing the ideological war played out in a single courtroom. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of Greenglass, who described the specific geographical handoffs of information and the context of the conspiracy. Greenglass was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge and received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against his sister and brother-in-law. The defense argued that the case was a political persecution driven by the anti-communist atmosphere of the time. The jury found both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg guilty of conspiracy to commit espionage. The sentence handed down by Judge Irving Kaufman was death. This unprecedented severity, the first time American civilians had ever been executed for espionage, was explicitly tied to the perceived geographical and global consequence of their actions. Kaufman stated that their crime was worse than murder, arguing that their theft of the atomic secret caused the Korean War and was responsible for the hundreds of thousands of lives lost, fundamentally altering the geographical and political map of the world. The atmosphere of the following 2 years was consumed by a worldwide campaign for clemency. Appeals were lodged to the Supreme Court, and political pressure was applied from international figures, including the Pope and Albert Einstein, arguing that the geographical and circumstantial nature of Ethel's involvement was insufficient for the death penalty. All appeals failed. The execution took place at Sing Sing Prison on the evening of Friday, June 19, 1953. In the dark, contained geography of the prison's electric chair chamber, Julius Rosenberg was executed first. Ethel Rosenberg followed. Due to her smaller size and the severity of the electrical current, it took multiple shocks to end her life. The execution was the most politically charged death in American legal history. The geographical reality of the event, a seemingly routine judicial killing in a confined prison space, sent a shockwave that resonated across the global stage. The controversy over their guilt, particularly Ethel's, persisted for decades. The geographical and forensic truth was eventually revealed many years later through the release of Soviet intelligence documents, the Venona Papers, and subsequent confessions. These documents confirmed that Julius was, indeed, a deep-cover Soviet operative who ran a significant network, and that Ethel was aware of and participated in the conspiracy. However, historians have concluded that Ethel's role in the actual passing of information was far more limited than Julius's. Today, Sing Sing Prison remains a high-security state correctional facility, its location on the Hudson River a geographical constant. The execution chamber is now gone, replaced by a minimum security block. The case of the Rosenbergs is not a murder mystery, but a historical study of how the theft of technological information, facilitated by the geographical mobility of spies and couriers, had the power to redefine global geopolitics. Their ultimate fate was decided not by the physical act of murder, but by the perceived, catastrophic geographical consequence of their ideological commitment to the Soviet Union. Next story, the murder of Bella in the Wych Elm. Hagley Wood, Worcestershire, England, 1943. Situated near the small village of Hagley, the wood was a dense, ancient copse of oak, holly, and the eponymous wych elm, known for its twisted, often impenetrable undergrowth. The air was perpetually cool and damp, carrying the heavy scent of moss, fungi, and wet earth. This was a geography where sound did not travel well and human presence was easily absorbed by the vast, quiet wilderness. The time was the middle of World War II, a period of massive national tension and social disruption. The atmosphere of rural England was overlaid with the paranoia of wartime security, fears of spies, sabotage, and enemy activity. The discovery was made on the afternoon of Sunday, April 18, 1943. For young boys from the nearby village, Robert Hart, Thomas Willits, Bob Farmer, and Fred Payne were trespassing in the wood, poaching birds and nests. They were far from the main paths, deep within the tangled internal geography of the wood. Their attention was drawn to a huge, solitary wych elm tree. The tree was particularly old and gnarled, and the boys noticed that one of the hollows in its trunk, a vertical fissure several feet up, looked like an ideal place for a bird's nest. Thomas Willits, the smallest, climbed up to investigate the cavity. What he found inside the contained, vertical geography of the tree trunk was not a nest, but a human skull, visible through the dark, damp opening. The boys, terrified, initially agreed to keep their discovery a secret, aware they were trespassing. However, Thomas Willits, overwhelmed by the horror, eventually confessed to his parents, and the discovery was reported to the police. The police investigation of the crime scene was challenging due to the wood's dense, isolated geography. Within the cavity of the elm tree, which served as a natural, narrow coffin, investigators found the virtually complete skeleton of a woman. The forensic reality of the discovery was complex: confinement. The body had been crammed into the hollow space while the flesh was still on the bones, suggesting the victim was placed there relatively soon after death. Partial remains, a hand, severed at the wrist, was found buried nearby, a clear attempt at concealing identifying marks, associated items. Investigators found a crepe-soled shoe, fragments of clothing, a wedding ring, and a piece of taffeta fabric, which was later determined to have been used as a gag, found stuffed in the skull's mouth. Forensic analysis by Professor James Webster of Birmingham University determined that the remains belonged to a woman in her mid-30s with light brown hair. The medical evidence suggested she had died approximately 18 months prior to the discovery, around late 1941, and had likely been dead for at least a month before being stuffed into the tree. The cause of death was believed to be suffocation, consistent with the gagging. The confinement of the body within the elm tree had preserved the bones remarkably well. The geographical puzzle was immediate. Who was this woman? How did she get to this remote location? And why was she placed in the trunk of a tree? The war compounded the problem. Thousands of people were displaced, and finding a missing person from 18 months prior was virtually impossible. The case went cold. The most famous, enduring geographical element of the mystery came in 1944, a year after the body was found. Across the widespread, diverse geography of the Midlands, on walls, doorsteps, and gravestones, a chilling piece of anonymous graffiti began to appear. Written in chalk or paint, always in capital letters, it asked the question that has defined the case. Who put La Bella down the wych elm? Later, the message evolved to, who put Bella in the wych elm? The name Bella quickly became the official nickname for the unidentified victim. The graffiti transformed the silent, local tragedy into a national, geographical legend, asserting that someone knew the identity of the victim or the killer. The investigation continued for decades, fueled by the persistent mystery and the geographical evidence provided by the graffiti. One of the strongest theories linked the victim to a possible Nazi spy ring. This theory, supported by a 1941 police report, involved a Dutch woman named Clarabella Dronkers, who was known to be married to a German spy and disappeared around the time of the murder. The geographical element of her disappearance, the connection to espionage and wartime transport, fit the atmosphere of time. Another compelling theory, suggested by a confession from a relative of the killer decades later, tied the murder to a woman named Una Mossad and a family secret involving her husband and an associate, who was supposedly driving the victim, a friend named Bella, and killed her, stuffing her body into the tree cavity. This theory, while never proven, focused on the idea that the remote geographical site was chosen purely for rapid, opportunistic disposal. The identity of Bella and the true identity of the Qualtro, like figure who placed her remains in the tree, remain the defining, unsolved aspects of the case. The geographical atmosphere of the ancient would provided the perfect mechanism for both concealment and preservation. Today, Hagleywood remains a dense, private, and quiet geography. The specific wych elm tree has been partially removed. The atmosphere of the place is still one of deep, unsettling silence. The case of Bella and the wych elm is a unique historical study of how a single, isolated geographical feature, the hollow of a tree, was used to contain a terrible wartime secret that was ultimately given voice by the haunting simplicity of anonymous public graffiti. Next story, the murders of the Blackout Ripper. London, England, 1942. Fundamentally transformed by the grim reality of World War II, the city was under a strict nightly blackout, which was the defining feature of the environment. The air, perpetually cold and damp in winter, smelled of soot, dust from bombed-out buildings, and the distinct cloying odor of burnt gypsum and damp concrete. The soundscape was eerie and intermittent. The distant, muffled thrum of the city's remaining traffic, the sudden, alarming wail of air raid sirens, and, most commonly, the unnerving, pervasive quiet of the blackout itself. Without streetlights, and with windows completely curtained, the streets were reduced to a state of absolute, unlit, three-dimensional darkness. This geographical condition of total darkness provided the ultimate cover for a predator. The crimes took place primarily in the confined, working-class geography of the West End and Soho, districts that still thrived late at night, catering to soldiers on leave and the women who worked in the area. The central figure was a man later dubbed the Blackout Ripper or Wartime Ripper. The victim profile was consistent. Women who were either working as prostitutes or living on the social margins in the dangerous atmosphere of wartime London. The sequence of the murders was a terrifying cluster, all occurring during the strictest blackout hours. February 9th, 1942, Southwick Evelyn Hamilton, 41, was found dead in a bombed-out shelter. She had been severely beaten and strangled. February 14th, 1942, Paddington Evelyn Oatley, 35, was found in her flat, her throat severely cut and mutilated. February 16th, 1942, Soho Margaret Lowe, 32, was found dead in her flat, brutally strangled and her body mutilated. February 17th, 1942, Paddington Doris Joannet, 32, was discovered in her apartment, having been strangled. The geographical pattern of the murders, clustered within days of each other, all occurring in the dense, inner-city atmosphere of the West End, suggested a single, highly active killer who was moving swiftly through the city's unlit streets. The killer was utilizing the blackout not just for concealment, but as a deliberate weapon. The total darkness provided a psychological shield, making the act of violence in a confined space less visible and resistance less effective. The atmosphere of London, already tense from the threat of German bombs, erupted into full-blown panic. The police, dealing with the constant chaos of the Blitz, were faced with a serial killer whose method echoed the terror of Jack the Ripper, but whose environment was exponentially darker. The immense pressure to end the threat was paramount. The turning point came with the investigation into the last victim, Doris Joannet. Detectives focused on the small geographical area around her apartment building in the Paddington district. They meticulously questioned people who had been in the vicinity, particularly American soldiers who frequented the nearby establishments. The killer's signature was the dismemberment of the victim's body after the murder. A break occurred when a witness recalled seeing a man running from Joannet's apartment building shortly after the murder. The description led police to an unexpected geographical figure, Private Gordon Frederick Cummins, a 28-year-old aircraftsman in the Royal Air Force. He was a man with a deceptive, charming outward appearance, dressed in the uniform of the armed services, giving him immediate, unquestioned access and geographical mobility across the blackout city. The crucial forensic evidence that directly linked Cummins to the crimes was found not at the crime scenes, but in a small leather gas mask case carried by the suspect. Cummins was arrested after a botched attack on a fifth victim, who managed to escape and identify him. The geographical context of the arrest led to the definitive evidence. In his gas mask case, police found items that irrefutably linked him to the victims. A wallet containing an old ration book belonging to Evelyn Oatley, a silk handkerchief belonging to Margaret Lowe, and other small, personal effects from the women. Cummins, believing the blackout was absolute and his movements untraceable, had become reckless, carrying these incriminating, geographically sourced trophies of his kills. The subsequent search of Cummins's lodgings provided further circumstantial evidence that tied him to the murder sites. The proximity of his RAF base to the areas of the murders and his use of a uniform to move freely provided the final context for the geographical planning of the crimes. The trial was conducted in a London still gripped by the war, but focused entirely on the terror from within. The prosecution presented the overwhelming evidence of the victim's stolen property found on Cummins, connecting him forensically to the geographically separate crime scenes. The speed and brutality of the attacks, all committed under the cover of the military blackout, was the terrifying common denominator. Cummins was convicted and executed in June 1942. The Blackout Ripper case remains a powerful historical footnote to the London Blitz. It is an exceptional illustration of how the geographical reality of wartime, the total, military-enforced darkness, was expertly exploited by a serial killer to carry out a rapid succession of violent acts. The silence and the anonymity of the unlit streets provided the perfect, temporary veil for a psychopath whose own uniform allowed him to move like a ghost through the terrified city. The ultimate irony is that the same absolute darkness that protected his crimes led to his recklessness and ultimate capture through the small, portable geography of a gas mask case. Next story, the murders of the Blackout Ripper. London, England, 1942. Fundamentally transformed by the grim reality of World War II, the city was under a strict nightly blackout, which was the defining feature of the environment. The air, perpetually cold and damp in winter, smelled of soot, dust from bombed-out buildings, and the distinct cloying odor of burnt gypsum and damp concrete. The soundscape was eerie and intermittent. The distant, muffled thrum of the city's remaining traffic, the sudden, alarming wail of air raid sirens, and, most commonly, the unnerving, pervasive quiet of the blackout itself. Without streetlights, and with windows completely curtained, the streets were reduced to a state of absolute, unlit, three-dimensional darkness. This geographical condition of total darkness provided the ultimate cover for a predator. The crimes took place primarily in the confined, working-class geography of the West End and Soho, districts that still thrived late at night, catering to soldiers on leave and the women who worked in the area. The central figure was a man later dubbed the Blackout Ripper or Wartime Ripper. The victim profile was consistent. Women who were either working as prostitutes or living on the social margins in the dangerous atmosphere of wartime London. The sequence of the murders was a terrifying cluster, all occurring during the strictest blackout hours. February 9th, 1942, Southwark Evelyn Hamilton, 41, was found dead in a bombed-out shelter. She had been severely beaten and strangled. February 14th, 1942, Paddington Evelyn Oatley, 35, was found in her flat, her throat severely cut and mutilated. February 16th, 1942, Soho Margaret Lowe, 32, was found dead in her flat, brutally strangled and her body mutilated. February 17th, 1942, Paddington Doris Joannet, 32, was discovered in her apartment, having been strangled. The geographical pattern of the murders, clustered within days of each other, all occurring in the dense, inner-city atmosphere of the West End, suggested a single, highly active killer who was moving swiftly through the city's unlit streets. The killer was utilizing the blackout not just for concealment, but as a deliberate weapon. The total darkness provided a psychological shield, making the act of violence in a confined space less visible and resistance less effective. The atmosphere of London, already tense from the threat of German bombs, erupted into full-blown panic. The police, dealing with the constant chaos of the Blitz, were faced with a serial killer whose method echoed the terror of Jack the Ripper, but whose environment was exponentially darker. The immense pressure to end the threat was paramount. The turning point came with the investigation into the last victim, Doris Joannet. Detectives focused on the small geographical area around her apartment building in the Paddington district. They meticulously questioned people who had been in the vicinity, particularly American soldiers who frequented the nearby establishments. The killer's signature was the dismemberment of the victim's body after the murder. A break occurred when a witness recalled seeing a man running from Joannet's apartment building shortly after the murder. The description led police to an unexpected geographical figure. Private Gordon Frederick Cummins, a 28-year-old aircraftsman in the Royal Air Force. He was a man with a deceptive, charming outward appearance, dressed in the uniform of the armed services, giving him immediate, unquestioned access and geographical mobility across the blackout city. The crucial forensic evidence that directly linked Cummins to the crimes was found not at the crime scenes, but in a small leather gas mask case carried by the suspect. Cummins was arrested after a botched attack on a fifth victim, who managed to escape and identify him. The geographical context of the arrest led to the definitive evidence. In his gas mask case, police found items that irrefutably linked him to the victims. A wallet containing an old ration book belonging to Evelyn Oatley, a silk handkerchief belonging to Margaret Lowe, and other small, personal effects from the women. Cummins, believing the blackout was absolute and his movements untraceable, had become reckless, carrying these incriminating, geographically sourced trophies of his kills. The subsequent search of Cummins's lodgings provided further circumstantial evidence that tied him to the murder sites. The proximity of his RAF base to the areas of the murders and his use of the uniform to move freely provided the final context for the geographical planning of the crimes. The trial was conducted in a London still gripped by the war, but focused entirely on the terror from within. The prosecution presented the overwhelming evidence of the victim's stolen property found on Cummins, connecting him forensically to the geographically separate crime scenes. The speed and brutality of the attacks, all committed under the cover of the military blackout, was the terrifying common denominator. Cummins was convicted and executed in June 1942. The Blackout Ripper case remains a powerful historical footnote to the London Blitz. It is an exceptional illustration of how the geographical reality of wartime, the total, military-enforced darkness, was expertly exploited by a serial killer to carry out a rapid succession of violent acts. The silence and the anonymity of the unlit streets provided the perfect, temporary veil for a psychopath whose own uniform allowed him to move like a ghost through the terrified city. The ultimate irony is that the same absolute darkness that protected his crimes led to his recklessness and ultimate capture through the small, portable geography of a gas mask case. Now, on to the next story. Between 1918 and 1919, the city of New Orleans was gripped by a series of violent and mysterious attacks that would come to define one of the most unsettling chapters in the city's history. The perpetrator came to be known as the Axeman of New Orleans, a figure whose identity was never discovered, yet whose crimes left a city on edge and a culture forever marked by fear and speculation. The first known attack occurred on the night of May 23, 1918, in a small home on Felicity Street. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, a Sicilian-American couple, were asleep when an intruder entered their home through the back door. Using a straight razor and an axe he found in their house, the assailant attacked the sleeping couple. Catherine was killed. Joseph survived, though with severe injuries. The intruder had not ransacked the home, nor had he taken any valuables. The motive was unclear, and the brutality seemingly random. Over the following months, the attacks continued. Typically, the victims were Italian immigrants or members of the working-class community, though this was not universal. The assailants seemed to enter homes with ease, often while the residents slept, and used whatever weapons were available, most commonly axes or hatchets found within the house. The lack of consistent motive, combined with the seemingly arbitrary choice of victims, made the attacks particularly alarming. The city's police force, already under strain due to the aftermath of World War I and the influenza pandemic, struggled to contain the panic. Newspapers covered the story extensively, reporting every new incident in detail. The public was advised to lock doors and keep watch through the night, though many doubted that even vigilance could prevent the next attack. Families slept in groups, keeping lights on and weapons close at hand. As the months passed, the axeman's methods remained erratic. He often entered through unlocked doors, but sometimes forced entry. He avoided leaving fingerprints, footprints, or other forensic evidence, which at the time was difficult to gather anyway. In some cases, he left notes. One particularly famous note, published in the New Orleans Times-Picayune, was addressed to the city itself. In it, the writer claimed to be the axeman and stated that he would spare anyone who played jazz music in their homes on a particular night. The letter read as a mixture of threat and dark humor, specifying that those who refused to play music would meet a violent end. The letter created a citywide response. On March 13, 1919, nearly every home in New Orleans reportedly played jazz from midnight until dawn. Street musicians performed on corners. Families sang from windows. Pianos and fiddles echoed through neighborhoods. According to reports, no murders occurred that night, though some historians debate the accuracy of this detail. Regardless, the story contributed to the myth of the axeman, intertwining the crimes with the culture of the city, its music, and its Italian-American communities. Over time, a pattern emerged. The attacks generally targeted families of Italian descent, though not exclusively. They occurred at night, usually in homes with little to no security. The weapons were rarely brought in from outside, indicating that the assailant had access to the home's own tools and a knowledge of the interiors. No motive was ever definitively established. Police considered robbery, revenge, personal vendettas, and even insanity, but nothing fit consistently. The randomness, combined with the media coverage, amplified fear and speculation. Despite extensive investigation, the Axeman was never caught. Various suspects were arrested over the years, ranging from local laborers to Italian immigrants with past criminal records, but none could be conclusively linked to the attacks. The city attempted increased policing, neighborhood watches, and community meetings, yet the assaults continued until around October 1919, when they abruptly stopped. No one knows why the attacks ceased. Theories suggest the killer may have moved away, been arrested for unrelated crimes, died, or simply lost interest. In the decades since, the Axeman of New Orleans has become part of American folklore. He represents a particular kind of urban fear, the idea that danger can enter the most private and secure spaces without warning. Yet, unlike many serial killers, the Axeman is remembered as much for the social reaction to his crimes as for the crimes themselves. The jazz letter, in particular, stands out as a cultural moment, linking terror with music in a uniquely New Orleans fashion. Historians have noted that the Axeman case reflects larger societal tensions of the period. The Italian immigrant community faced discrimination and scrutiny, which shaped public perception of the crimes. Newspaper accounts often emphasized the ethnicity of the victims, and some residents suspected mob involvement or inter-family feuds. Others interpreted the attacks as inexplicable violence, a reminder that fear can grow from randomness itself. Today, the Axeman is remembered not for resolution, but for the mood he imposed on a city, a blend of anxiety, superstition, and resilience. Musicians continue to play the jazz that once, according to legend, saved lives. Residents and visitors alike tell the story as part of the history of New Orleans, a narrative that combines the real horrors of violent crime with the city's enduring spirit and cultural identity. The legend of the Axeman endures because it sits at the intersection of fact and myth. We know the victims, the dates, the letters, and the attacks. We know that 5 people, perhaps more, were murdered and that countless others lived in fear. But we do not know the identity of the killer. He is, in that sense, an enigma, a shadow moving through the streets of a city that refuses to forget him, leaving behind only stories, music, and unanswered questions. In imagining the Axeman's presence, one can picture the quiet nights of New Orleans, the narrow streets lined with clapboard homes, the sound of wind rustling through the eaves. A figure moves silently from house to house, unseen and unknown, while inside families listen to the creaking floors, wondering if this night will be different. It is a tension without resolution, a story without closure, yet it persists, compelling attention even in the calm of reflection. The case reminds us that fear is not only born from certainty, but from uncertainty. The sense that an event could occur anywhere, at any time, and that normal life can be disrupted by an invisible force. In the Axeman's crimes, the ordinary became unpredictable, and the ordinary response, turning up lights, playing music, watching over one another, became both protective and ritualistic. In this way, the story is less about the killer and more about human behavior in the face of inexplicable danger. Though over a century has passed, the Axeman of New Orleans remains unsolved. No confession, no capture, no revelation has changed that. Yet the story continues to fascinate. The letters, the random attacks, the cultural interplay of fear and music, and the lasting imprint on the city. The Axeman is not just a historical figure. He is a symbol of a certain kind of quiet menace, one that can enter the home, disrupt life, and vanish without a trace, leaving a city to adjust, endure, and remember. Next story, Seville, Kent, the Mr. Witcher case, England, 1860s. The quiet village of Road Hill House in Wiltshire, England, seemed a picture of Victorian propriety in June 1860. Manicured gardens, tidy households, and orderly families gave the impression of peace and stability. But behind the doors of one home, a horror was unfolding that would shock the nation, inspire new police methods, and cement the reputation of Detective Inspector Jonathan Witcher, one of England's first professional detectives. Seville Kent, a 3-year-old boy, was the son of the wealthy Kent family. The house was large, filled with staff, and carefully managed. Yet one morning, young Seville was discovered missing. The family assumed at first that he had wandered off, but it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary disappearance. Panic spread through the household, and local authorities were summoned to investigate. Jonathan Witcher, an inspector with Scotland Yard, arrived to take the case. Witcher was known for his methodical, logical approach to crime, relying on observation, deduction, and emerging police techniques. Unlike the sensationalist detectives of fiction, Witcher focused on evidence and human behavior, understanding that appearances often concealed motives and opportunity. The scene of the crime was carefully examined. The household was combed for clues, servants interviewed, and the environment analyzed for inconsistencies. Witcher noticed small details others overlooked: footprints in the mud, signs of forced entry, and the location of personal items that seemed out of place. From the beginning, he suspected that the crime had occurred within the household itself, rather than at the hands of an outsider. Days later, the boy's body was discovered in a remote part of the house, brutally murdered. The nature of the crime, a child killed in his own home, sent shockwaves through the community. The brutality contrasted sharply with the orderly life the family had presented to the world. The house, once a symbol of security, now represented terror and betrayal. Witcher's investigation focused on the family and staff, particularly Constance Kent, Seville's 12-year-old half-sister. Evidence suggested that she had knowledge of the crime and possibly involvement. Her behavior during questioning, the inconsistencies in her story, and her unusual familiarity with areas of the house raised suspicion. Witcher believed the murder was premeditated, involving knowledge of household routines and access to keys, hallways, and children's rooms. The case became a media sensation. Newspapers across England reported on every detail, from the discovery of the body to Witcher's relentless pursuit of clues. Public fascination was fueled by the combination of wealth, innocence, and brutality. A young child murdered in a refined household, with an investigator challenging assumptions and digging into family secrets. Pamphlets and illustrations circulated, depicting the crime scene and suspects, capturing the Victorian imagination. Witcher faced resistance from the family and community. Many could not believe that a young girl could commit such a crime, and the idea that the murderer was someone inside the house was deeply uncomfortable. Yet the evidence mounted. The trajectory of events, the placement of the child's body, and admissions made under questioning all pointed to Constance. The case highlighted both the emerging professionalism of police work and the biases of society, particularly regarding age, gender, and social status. Eventually, Constance King confessed to the murder, though some historians argue her confession may have been influenced by guilt, fear, and pressure from authorities rather than full clarity about her motives. She was tried and convicted, sentenced to death, though her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Witcher's meticulous investigation was celebrated in some quarters and criticized in others, particularly by those who resented the implication that a family could harbor such darkness within its walls. The Mr. Witcher case is remembered for its impact on both policing and public perception. Witcher's methods, careful observation, reliance on evidence, and psychological insight became a model for detectives in England and beyond. The case also demonstrated the uncomfortable reality that violence could emerge from the most seemingly respectable households, and that children, often seen as innocent, could harbor motives and capability for murder. In the years following the trial, the case entered legend. Writers, journalists, and later historians revisited it, analyzing the events, the investigation, and the societal reactions. The murder of Seville Kent became emblematic of Victorian anxieties about family, morality, and the hidden potential for evil in everyday life. Witcher himself became a figure of fascination, celebrated for his insight, yet also portrayed as relentless, sometimes obsessive, in pursuit of the truth. For the people of Road Hill and the surrounding communities, the impact lingered. Households became more cautious, parents more vigilant, and the story of a young girl murdering her brother became a tale whispered for generations. The combination of innocence, betrayal, and meticulous detective work ensured that the case would remain a point of reference for both true crime enthusiasts and students of criminal history.